the Bible. Today we begin at the beginning, as Maria in Sound of Music said. And we have with us John Hewitt, Devin Dundee, and Nathan Burrow. They will give us the scoop, the lowdown on Genesis. Well, John, who was your scholar and what did you learn this week?
I actually had three authors this week. One was Susan Niditch, Ann W. Stewart, and Elaine James. These three women discussed the portrayal of women in Genesis and how their roles in the overall narrative speak to the social structure of the Israelite community and in the male-dominated culture. So this commentary notes the frequent portrayal of women as the character of trickster in Genesis, and how this is often a common character within ancient Near Eastern stories, but it's also a very important character. What's interesting about Genesis, though, is that you have these women who are in these marginal, behind-the-scenes roles, but they end up having very important roles to the overall development of the story. So, in essence, they're saying that though they are a small part, they work behind the scenes, and they change the private realm rather than the public realm.
Okay. Devin, who was your scholar and what did you learn?
My scholar was Rodney S. Sadler Jr. out of the Africana Bible, and he talked about how the central themes of complicated family relations and divine providence are very relatable to people of African heritage. Throughout the article, he compared Genesis to quotes from another book that deals with providence family issues, and that's Alice Walker's The Color Purple. And he says that The Color Purple adds a woman's voice that is missing from the book of Genesis. So a few things that he talked about. He said that universal human worth is found in Genesis' claim that all people are created in the image of God. And that this can be a way of just putting everyone on the same playing field, which can be very important for obviously people of African heritage. When dealing with oppression and subjugation. He also spent some time debunking the artificial insertion of race into the stories of Noah's sons, like the curse of Ham, and how that's been used to justify slavery. He just rejects that completely and talks about why that's just not something that was should be in the original text. He compares Seeley from The Color Purple to Hagar especially, but also to Bilhah, Zilpah, and even to Leah, who, although she wasn't a slave, she was forced to be in this relationship with this man who didn't love her. And so he compares the plight of Seeley, who's a slave in an American context, to these women who were slaves in biblical times. He says that even though Genesis is a patriarchal book, there are glimmers of hope for the enslaved women, especially for Hagar, who is saved by God in the wilderness and is promised that through her son Ishmael they'll become a great nation. And so he says that while we're dealing with these stories of enslaved women in Genesis, we need to be careful readers and to avoid any reading of Scripture that might reinforce oppression or work against the goals of liberation. And he says we need to find out what Scripture really says about family and about God. He finishes up by talking about Joseph and how his rise from slavery can be an example to people who are in slavery, who have come from that history, and how Joseph's story offers a theology of hope in that in its assertion of divine providence, even in the context of slavery and oppression.
Oh, okay. Nathan, who was your scholar and what did you learn?
My scholar was Claire Amos, and she was interesting because her background, she actually taught the Hebrew Bible while living in the Middle East, and so her commentary relates a lot to the actual location, and it kind of shapes, that's a lot of what her perspective that she's drawing out is how the land itself has a direct tie to the relationship of the people and of God, and how those unique relationships are woven together. And of course she brings it forward to the fact that you have the three major religions that are all still tied to that location today. So from the beginning of the book to the end of the book, she holds how how the land and the God of the land and the people all have this interwoven relationship, and that can still be seen even in Jerusalem today with Jews, Christians, and Muslims, each clinging to the land and the story as central to their identity.
So the interplay between land and story. John, tell us about what questions you would put to Dr. Sadler.
My question is for A.W. Stewart, who wrote the section. Sorry. Who wrote the section concerning the role of Eve in Genesis and how people have often interpreted her throughout history.
Yes.
She notes specifically how early Jewish, Christian, and Muslim texts usually show Eve in a very negative light, but then she also brings in the modern feminist interpretation that's trying to reclaim Eve as an intelligent, positive, curious figure. So my question for her would be, how does one balance a fair interpretation of the cultural context with Genesis, how it's very steeped in the patriarchal structure, and also combat a negative marginal view of Eve?
Mm-hmm.
How do you balance that?
Yeah. Eve is a complicated character, and her curiosity really sort of propels the story. And one of the things embedded in the story is how Eve continues to have curiosity, and how Adam is depicted as not particularly curious. And so there's a power relationship, but the power relationship is offset by the variable of curiosity. So Adam would be the more powerful character, but he is not the one who pushes the story along. Eve pushes the story along, even though she is not the more powerful character. So in the Genesis 2 and 3, you have not powerful characters who, in a sense, become the star of the story for a moment in order for the story to go forward. And so with Eve, one of the questions you might pose to a reader is, how do we marginalize curiosity in a postmodern world? Devin, I think now I'm ready to ask the question, what would you ask of Dr. Sadler?
Dr. Sadler, like I said, the conclusion he kind of comes to about the cultural context and the way it works with slavery and slave women is we have to be careful readers, and we need to find out what the Bible actually says about family and about God. So my question to him would be, once he looks past all the cultural context and the problems with that, what would he say the Bible actually has to say about family and about God? And then does Genesis have anything helpful to say about slavery, or should that just be dismissed as a reflection of the culture out of which the text came?
Good questions. I think he would say that the reception history of Genesis 9 does not determine the meaning of Genesis 9, but it does illustrate how those passages were used. He's arguing used improperly. I would say, not that I'm supporting the African slave trade, but I think it's interesting that those early readers recognized the story that was meant to justify oppression of one people group, and they just changed the people group. So Genesis 9 is really about why the Hebrews can oppress the Canaanites. And so you had Europeans saying, well, then this also can be used to say why Europeans can oppress Africans. So they are doing a type of form criticism. And while the Sadler is absolutely correct, our sort of notion of race does not seem to be embedded in the Genesis 9. But Genesis 9 does have a sense of people from a certain area or from a certain tribe. So, Nathan, what question would you ask Professor Amos?
I really liked her commentary, but she stresses a point about the growing relationship between, or the maturing relationship between God and man. And in kind of closing her commentary on Genesis, she states that we do a disservice, typically in Christian education, whenever we use these stories specifically aimed in teaching children, and just using the characters as simplistic moral exemplars. And I agree with the argument that she's making there, that we lose something by that being a pretty common, that this is usually a text where a lot of children learn about God and the Bible. The only question I have to her suggestion that we should move away from that is, she does not give a good alternative. What would be a good way to educate young people about God and Scripture if you do take these, if you want to look somewhere else? And so that would be my question to her, is what is a better way to introduce young people to God and Scripture if you want to avoid making Genesis that place?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for many of our congregations, we have the sort of children's Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And the children's Bible is a sort of G-rated telling of the story. And it sounds like she's sort of pushing back from that G-rated. And I would think that the G-rated story is a great place to begin. And then as you get more age appropriate, then folks read the full and complex text. To say that, so that folks can let go of Abraham and Sarah as moral exemplars, but at first you have to get to know them.
Right. She makes a statement in there that the text provides us with difficult questions rather than offering easy answers, and I think maybe you can let the reader also grow with the text, to your point, because I think you can move on from, oh well, there's just simple answers here, to yeah, this really is pushing some challenging questions.
I think this is one of the places where we'd ask some spiritual formation questions in terms of how we deal with Scripture. At a certain formation period, then you deal with the text in a particular way. As someone becomes more mature in their faith, then you really want to problematize. But if I'm dealing with someone in primary school, I want them to get the storyline and the broader theological themes. 6-year-olds are not great with a problematized Abraham.
Right.
That's going to create a lot more trouble than it's going to help. By the time you become a young adult, now you can deal with the more problematized. Now, the challenge with that is you can sometimes get young adults who say, well, you cheated me because you didn't tell me the full story when I was 7 years old. Sure. But yeah.
I guess that would just be one thing that I would question her about and maybe push back a little bit, is I think you can do both. It does require a little bit more investment and work, but I think to avoid the rich imagery here that feeds young faith as well, I think it's a book that has enough depth to be able to meet both.
Meet both. Both is a good place for us to think about closing out our episode. Now, I know that you're asking, what the blog? In our next episode, we'll see the first What the Blog feature. I hope you do tune back and see us as we move on from Genesis to Exodus. And I want to thank our guests today, Nathan Burrow, Devin Dundee, and John Hewitt. Our executive producer once again was Andy Clark. We hope to see you again in our next episode. Thank you.